Venezuela, then Iran. The question now is, could Cuba be next? It doesn't look like there has been anything subtle about the hints President Trump has been dropping lately. The leaders running the communist island of Cuba may be living on borrowed time. As the country struggles through power outages, fuel rationing, and a crumbling infrastructure, the United States appears to be setting the stage for what some believe could become another operation similar to what happened in Venezuela. An operation that could see the country's regime leadership removed and the island, long seen as a hostile base for America's enemies, finally opened up. Some say the Cuban leadership wants a deal badly, far more than they are publicly willing to admit. In Havana, when night falls, the streets are often lit only by the moon and the occasional passing car. Much of the island has once again been plunged into darkness after failures in the national power grid. These blackouts are not rare events anymore. In addition to large-scale outages, the population now deals with routine power cuts that can last more than 15 hours at a time. For many Cubans, electricity has become something uncertain, something that can disappear at any moment. This growing crisis raises an important question. Could the events unfolding in other parts of the world, particularly in Iran, have an impact on what might happen in Cuba? Some analysts believe they absolutely could. They argue that authoritarian regimes often depend on each other to survive. When one begins to collapse, it sends a shockwave through the entire network. For years, Cuba relied heavily on its alliance with Venezuela. That relationship helped sustain the island's struggling economy, particularly through the flow of oil and fuel. But now that relationship has been disrupted. At the same time, Cuba's connections with Iran, Russia, and China are facing increasing pressure as global tensions shift. The system that once helped prop up the Cuban government is weakening. Inside Cuba, the government's power structure has always depended heavily on control by the military. The military controls large parts of the economy. It oversees major industries, trade, tourism operations, and countless state-run enterprises. In many ways, it controls everything. But even that centralized system has struggled to keep the country functioning. Fuel shortages have become severe. Public transportation is unreliable because buses often have no gasoline. Personal vehicles sit unused because people simply cannot find fuel. Across the island, bicycles have become one of the primary ways people move from place to place. Airports operate with limited flights, and goods that once arrived regularly are now scarce. Daily life has become increasingly difficult for ordinary Cubans. The society itself appears to be slowing down, struggling to function as basic services fail, and many people are beginning to question the system that promised prosperity but has instead delivered decades of hardship. At the same time, events in other countries are sending a message that leaders in Havana cannot ignore. Venezuela, for example, looks very different today than it did just a short time ago. Once its longtime dictator was removed, the country began reopening and reconnecting with the outside world. For many Venezuelans, the possibility of freedom and economic recovery suddenly appeared on the horizon. Cuba's leadership is watching these developments very carefully. They know what happened in Venezuela, they know what is happening in Iran, and they understand that if the same kind of pressure begins building against them, the consequences could be very serious. For authoritarian governments, power is everything. Without the ability to control and suppress their populations, they lose the very foundation that keeps them in charge. That is why such regimes rarely give up power willingly. If they were to walk away peacefully, it would be one of the rarest moments in political history. Meanwhile, reports have begun surfacing that the United States may be exploring legal actions against members of Cuba's government. According to the Wall Street Journal, a federal prosecutor in Florida has been examining the possibility of building criminal cases against leaders within Cuba's government and the Communist Party. This strategy would mirror the approach used in Venezuela. Before Nicolás Maduro was removed from power, he had already been indicted in the United States. Those charges created the legal foundation for the actions that followed. If something similar were to happen with Cuban leadership, it could dramatically change the political landscape. For the people living on the island, the crisis is already undeniable. Blackouts are constant, fuel is scarce, basic goods are difficult to find, transportation systems barely function, planes cannot travel regularly, buses often fail to run. In many places, bicycles have become one of the primary ways people move from place to place. The government continues to promise progress, but for many citizens, those promises have lost credibility. The gap between official statements and everyday reality has become impossible to ignore. Legal experts say negotiations with the Cuban government are extremely difficult because the regime has historically relied on secrecy and misinformation to maintain control. Trust between the government and the outside world is limited at best. Negotiations often become little more than attempts to buy time. That pattern has played out repeatedly in the history of authoritarian regimes. When pressure builds, they promise reforms or agreements, hoping to delay consequences long enough for circumstances to change. But once the pressure fades, those promises often disappear.
At the same time, the international environment is shifting in ways that could leave Cuba increasingly isolated. For years, critics warned that any serious action against countries like Cuba might trigger a major confrontation with Russia or China. The assumption was that these powerful allies would step in to protect their partners. But recent events have challenged that belief. Russia and China did not intervene militarily during major developments involving Iran. Their responses were cautious and limited. That has led some observers to believe that similar restraint might occur if tensions surrounding Cuba were to escalate. Another factor shaping the situation is the complex economic network that once connected several of these regimes. Venezuelan oil, for example, was often shipped to Iran for refining because Venezuela lacked sufficient refining capacity. After being processed, some of that fuel would eventually be redistributed, including shipments that reached Cuba. This network allowed several struggling governments to support one another. But once one link in the chain broke, the entire system began to weaken. The collapse of Venezuela's old leadership disrupted the flow of oil and resources that Cuba had depended on for years. Without those supplies, Cuba's economy has faced even greater strain. Fuel shortages became worse, electricity production suffered, transportation systems slowed, the problems multiplied across the island. These regimes depended heavily on each other's survival. When one collapsed, the others suddenly became far more vulnerable. Today, the pressure on Cuba's leadership is building from multiple directions at once. Economic hardship is increasing, international alliances are weakening, and the examples of other fallen regimes are fresh in everyone's mind. For decades, Cuba has existed only 90 miles from the coast of Florida, yet separated by an enormous political and economic divide. Many Cuban Americans who fled the island built successful lives in the United States, particularly in Florida. Their success highlights the dramatic contrast between the opportunities available in a free economy and the struggles faced by those still living under the current system on the island. If Cuba were to open its economy and political system, the transformation could be enormous. American companies would likely invest heavily. Tourism could expand rapidly, trade would increase, infrastructure could be rebuilt. For the Cuban people, access to global markets and private enterprise could dramatically improve living conditions after decades of economic stagnation. But none of those changes can occur without major political shifts first. Right now, the situation inside Cuba remains tense and uncertain. Power outages continue, fuel remains scarce, public frustration quietly grows beneath the surface. Whether these pressures eventually lead to negotiation, reform, or something far more dramatic is impossible to say with certainty. But what is clear is that Cuba is facing one of the most unstable periods in its modern history. And as the world watches events unfold across other nations, many are beginning to ask the same question again. Venezuela came first, Iran may be next, so the question remains, could Cuba be next?